philosopher handles that which in all human cognition is the independent and lies at the fundament of everything. That is also why the philosophical is directly pleasing out of all doctrines. Philosophy is the science of appropriateness of all cognitions to the vocation of man. This includes, firstly, philodoxy, as the culture and instruction of all talents, that is, appropriateness of the cognitions to various purposes. Secondly, their appropriateness with the expended use of reason. Thirdly, the foundation of the highest maxims of the speculative as well as practical use of reason. Here the most immense scholarship, yes, even technique of reason of famous men ceases and is without philosophy. Metaphysics and morals, both of them architectonic, are the two door hinges of philosophy. The philosopher is no mythologist, but a knower of the laws of human reason. And the most distinguished laws are those which limit the presumptions of reason to the purpose of humanity. First off, extensive historical and rational cognition, as for a lawgiver, firstly, multiplicity of citizens and traits. To set laws for reason, one has to know it, but only in the maxims of reason there is philosophy. The other cognitions are philosophical, that is, belonging to it. Immanuel Kant. In the past lectures, I have talked extensively about what philosophy in the school sense means to Kant. I started out saying that it is about knowledge, but that to Kant, the common knowledge is just fragmentary, while scientific knowledge is systematic. I then explained that this systematic knowledge can either be historical scholarship, if it is not true knowledge, but rather simply awareness that something is the case without understanding that it has to be the case. Or it can be rational science if it is knowledge of laws that make us understand and even let us predict the singular individual cases that have to be that way according to that general law. And this rational science in turn can either be mathematical, if it is rational cognition through the construction of concepts in intuition, or it can be philosophical science if it is rational cognition of concepts. And then I said that this philosophical science, according to Kant, is either formal, and then it's logic, or it is material science or world wisdom. And in that case, it can either be theoretical, if it deals with the laws of being, of what is, or it can be practical if it deals with the laws of freedom, of what ought to be. And in both cases, there is a pure science, a metaphysics of nature or of morals, and we can also talk about an applied science, which is natural science, and in the case of practical philosophy it's a bit more unclear, but it might be the teaching or the doctrine of happiness. And I concluded with saying that to Kant, philosophy in the school sense is mainly metaphysics, and the core of it are the three ideas of God, immortality of the soul, and freedom. And the philosopher in the school sense is trying to have cognition about these three ideas mainly. And this is all fine and well, but it's maybe not completely satisfying. Kant himself says that philosophy is less about cognition, about the objects you have or try to have knowledge about. That is, once again, God, immortality, and freedom. And it is more so about the Denkungsart of the philosopher. Denkungsart could be translated as thinking mode or the way of thinking. That is what actually makes the philosopher, and that leads to what Kant calls the world concept of philosophy. And he says that the world concept is an ideal which has always, at least vaguely, laid beneath our concept of what a philosopher is. I mean, the very word philosophy, if we translate it from the Greek, means love for wisdom. So then the philosopher should be the one who is wise, or at least who strives to be wise. And that would mean that to Kant, philosophy is not mainly something theoretical, a certain science amongst other sciences, but it is first and foremost practical. And we could say that nowadays philosophy is seen as more theoretical. Nowadays, unfortunately, pretty much anyone who deals with philosophy or who has opinions about philosophy is called a philosopher. So all the professors at university are called philosophers, but they are not. They are dealing with philosophy or with philosophical questions theoretically, but most of them don't live as philosophers. Most of them aren't wise. Well, if we look back to the origins of philosophy amongst the ancient Greeks, we find that not all of the ancient philosophers were metaphysicians. Some certainly were, like Plato, but others, like Diogenes, didn't really care all that much about metaphysics. And if we consider Socrates, who is often considered the first philosopher, well, he famously said, "I know that I know nothing." So if we were to understand philosophy only by the school concept, only as a science, as an endeavor of trying to find certain knowledge, then Socrates with that statement wouldn't have been a very great philosopher. But even if he didn't have metaphysical knowledge, he was considered wise in ancient times. And that is what mattered to them. No matter which school of philosophy you belonged to, no matter if you were a Stoic philosopher or an Epicurean philosopher, what mattered first and foremost for the ancients was not simply that you had certain opinions, certain metaphysical positions or insights. What mattered was that you lived your life wisely. And only over time did the concept of what philosophy is shift more and more from the practical to the theoretical. And in Kant's day, it had already shifted quite a lot. Philosophers were mainly, well, that was mainly what people were called, that talked at university or that wrote books and that dealt with philosophical questions, but it probably was less so about their lifestyle, about their actual wisdom. And one could say that Kant's whole philosophy comes to the conclusion that the practical is more important than the theoretical, and that the theory has to serve the practice. His whole critical project, as I will show in future lectures, his whole critical project kind of leads to the conclusion that theoretically the philosophers can't know all that much. Theoretically, metaphysics can't have knowledge about the soul, the freedom, and God. But what really matters is the practical. What really matters is how we live our lives, how we conduct ourselves. So Kant's whole project could be seen in a way as him trying to re-emphasize the world concept of philosophy and showing that it is more important than the school concept, which is not to say the school concept's unimportant. I will talk about their relation in a later lecture as well. But ultimately, it all leads to the world concept of philosophy. And according to the world concept, the philosopher, once again, is the sage, or at least the one who is trying to be a sage. The philosopher in the world sense by Kant is called the researcher or the inquirer of wisdom. Well, this leads us naturally to the follow-up question: what is wisdom? And you may find that, just like with science, wisdom is one of those words we may have some vague concept of, but if we are asked to actually define it, lots of people would struggle with that probably. Well, the answer Kant gives is that wisdom is the idea of the necessary unity of all purposes. And when I say purpose in this lecture, I am translating the German word Zweck. I talked about this 2 lectures ago, about this concept of Zweck that is very important in Kant's philosophy, and that could into English be translated as end or point or purpose. I'm here going with purpose. I'm just pointing out that by purpose I mean what Kant calls the Zweck. Wisdom is the idea of the necessary unity of all purposes. What does it mean? Well, we all have, when we do something every day, we have certain purposes that we are trying to achieve. For example, presumably your purpose now when listening to me is to learn something about Kant. And my purpose talking into the camera and the microphone is teaching something about Kant. The problem now is that very often the various purposes we have are at odds with each other. That starts out even in childhood, like for example the kid at school probably has the purpose to get good grades, to one day graduate with good grades, to maybe have good chances at a career, good chances on the job market. But then again, the student also doesn't want to listen in class, the student doesn't want to study, and the student has other purposes like chatting with friends and um, being on his phone and so on. And they get in conflict with each other. Or maybe someone has a crush and uh, would like more closeness with that other person, um, would like getting together with that other person. Um, but that is one purpose. But on the other hand, maybe he's shy and maybe he doesn't dare speak to that person he's in love with. Um, or on the other hand, um, maybe you are together with someone already, um, but the relationship is not a good one. Maybe it is abusive even, or maybe it's not abusive, but it's just not a happy relationship. Um, but you don't dare breaking up for various reasons. Maybe you still can't get over that person, even though you're not happy with that person anymore. Or maybe you feel bad for that person. Maybe you feel like it's your fault. Or maybe you are more afraid of being alone than you are of continuing a bad relationship. Um, but once again, you have two purposes defeating each other, being at odds with each other. Or we have the purpose to live a long and healthy life. And then we end up poisoning ourselves with alcohol, with cigarettes. And this isn't just what's happening on the individual level. This is happening on bigger levels too. I mean, presumably, a lot of people do have the purpose or the goal that they want for themselves and for their children. They want a safe and secure and wealthy future. And at the same time, they are ruining that future. They are destroying our planet. They are driving our civilization closer and closer to collapse due to the climate and other ecological crises. All of this is the opposite of wisdom because there's disunity amongst your goals, amongst your purposes. And the opposite of wisdom could be called foolishness. So I will remark here that in German there are actually two different words for fool. One is Narr and one is Tor. And this is important because Kant uses both those words that many would take to be synonyms. He uses them for different meanings. To him, the Narr is more like the person who is not prudent, and the Tor is the person who is not wise, which to him are different things. I will come back to that in another lecture. And Narr would more closely be what is called a fool in English, because just like in English, the Narr can also be the word for the jester or for the person making fun at some king's court. So I would prefer to use the English word fool for Narr, and therefore for the person who is not prudent. But unfortunately, I can't think of another English word that I could use for the person who is not wise. So I will use the word fool here too. Maybe someone can point out another word for me. I try to find one, but It seems that, unfortunately, this nuance in Kant's thinking can't be conveyed in English so easily. So I'm continuing to use the word fool in this lecture, but in this lecture, when I use it, it will always mean what Kant calls Tor in German. People very often act foolish. That is, very often they act against their own interests, against their own purposes, and very often they end up going after the lesser purpose at the expense of the more important purpose. And many often they end up sacrificing the future for the moment, for momentary pleasure. And very often they even do so knowingly and do it nonetheless. Kant, however, does point out that as humans, we are all full of folly, as in we constantly give weight and importance to small things that maybe strictly rationally aren't really important. So, for example, when I go to visit my mother's grave, every year on her birthday and her death day, that would be called a folly by Kant. Because, I mean, if we look at it strictly rationally, she's dead. It's not like she cares. It's not like she even notices whether I go to the grave a day earlier or a day later. Or if I hold on to some old toy that I like to play with as a child, and I don't throw it away, even though I haven't played with it for years and probably never will again, that too would be a folly. And such follies, Kant says, are perfectly fine. And that's not enough to call me a fool. I would only be a fool if I started giving too much weight to these small follies and to sacrifice more important things for them. So it's okay to visit my mother's grave every year on the day of her death. But if in 1 year something more important comes up on that specific day, but I say, no, I can't deal with this more important thing. I have to visit the grave today. It absolutely has to happen today. I can't go tomorrow. Then I would be a fool. And likewise, it's okay to hold on to that old toy. But if one day a fire breaks out and my house burns down and I manage to save myself, but then I went back inside, risking my life just to save that old toy, then I would be a fool. Because in that case, I would be acting against a more important purpose, like staying alive, while as long as it's merely a folly, I may have an unimportant purpose, but it's not in direct conflict yet with a more important purpose, and it doesn't has to ever get in conflict with that. The true fool is the one who, once again, sacrifices the future for the moment, who sacrifices his real goals for one simple pleasure, or who is swept away by some passion. So when someone is infatuated, not in love. Kant doesn't have anything against love, but infatuation as a passion is a form of insanity, because you might be willing to throw everything else away and to ruin your life just for that one person. And maybe you will even continue to do so, even if that person treats you like crap, or even if that person doesn't feel anything for you. Or maybe you lose that person turns you down, and you get completely devastated over it. You get depressed over it, even though you could move on, and even though you otherwise have a good and promising life. That would make you a fool, being a slave to some passion. And likewise, Kant would say that when you are clinging to irrational desires that just can't be fulfilled, you also are a fool. So, if, for example, you wish to fly, and I don't mean by plane, but actually fly like a bird, um, a wise person would just understand that that's not possible for a human being and move on, and just shrug off that desire. Um, because it is foolish to cling to a desire and to be unhappy because that desire can't be fulfilled when it is an impossible desire. That's also why Kant would say if you have some illness that can't be cured, of course, if it can be cured, then it would be rational to try and get cured, to see a physician or whatever, to take the medicine. But if it's some illness that simply can't be cured, Kant would say that now feeling devastated because of that, and now weeping and crying and complaining about destiny, about having this illness, or if, for example, I got into an accident and I lost my legs or whatever, which is something that can't be undone, then I would be a fool to get devastated by that. I should instead, if I was wise, move on and try to make the best out of a maybe shitty situation. What is important to me is to stress that Kant, even though he sometimes gets portrayed like that by people who don't really know about his philosophy and about his personal life, Kant was not an enemy of life. He didn't reject life or the pleasures and the happiness of life. He was not some ascete or a pessimist, and he never said that being rationally just means being cold and unfeeling and just stoically doing your duty and never smiling during it. Quite the opposite. Kant himself had a quite Epicurean lifestyle, and he actually well respected Epicure as a thinker, and sometimes defended him against the accusations that due to the Christian ideology he had suffered for so many centuries, about just being about blind hedonism. No, he actually found quite a lot of value in Epicure's teaching. So to Kant, wisdom certainly isn't about having no desires or having no pleasures in life and no joys in life, but it is about self-regulation. The wise one, the sage, is not a slave to passions, is not a slave to blind desires and drives, but rather he governs himself and his own desires. I will talk more about this, about how one should live one's life and achieve happiness, according to Kant, in a later lecture. For now, I want to stay at the topic of wisdom. Wisdom means you have a unity of purposes. Your purposes don't get into conflict with one another. Well, how can that possibly be achieved? Well, our purposes can only be in conflict if they are completely different purposes. So, for example, let's say I would like to put a picture on my wall, but at the same time I'm lazy and I would like to just lay down on the couch. Well, there's a conflict here. But now, let's say once again I have the purpose to put a picture on the wall, and I have another purpose, which is to put a nail into the wall. Now, this purpose is not at odds with the purpose of putting a picture on the wall. Why is that? Because it is just a sub-purpose, so to speak. It just serves the higher goal of putting a picture on the wall. I'm not taking up the hammer and driving a nail into the wall for its own sake, but rather as one step in hanging up that picture. So purposes can't get at odds with each other if one of them serves the other. Well, that would mean that the wise person would have one highest purpose, and he would subject all other purposes to that one main purpose. And then there couldn't be conflict between them because they would all be directed at the same goal. What would that main purpose be, however? Well, it could only be the highest good. And this, I will say here, this is quite the important term in Kant's philosophy. We will hear about it again when I talk about Kant's moral philosophy and when I talk about his philosophy of religion. To both, especially to the second one, the highest good is an important term. But it is also important to his definition of wisdom and therefore his definition of philosophy. What is the highest good? Well, Kant says there are only really two goods, two goals that ultimately humans could strive for. One of them is happiness. You want to be happy, to live a happy life. And the other one is worthiness of being happy. Because they are clearly not the same. We could imagine someone evil who reaches his goals and attains certain pleasures and certain joys in life, but we would say he doesn't deserve that. And on the other hand, we could imagine someone who is good and who we would say would deserve being happy, but who still lives a life of pain and suffering for some reason. Well, the highest good then would be the combination of those two. Being happy while also deserving it, deserving happiness while also having it. And Kant says that that which leads to happiness is prudence, or world prudence, as he says. And that which makes one worthy of being happy is virtue. So being a moral person, being a good person. And that would mean that wisdom is the combination of those two. So the wise person is both virtuous, and prudent. And to Kant, the sage is merely an ideal. True wisdom, he says, can only be an attribute of God. As humans, we can have sort of an approximation of wisdom, or we can try to get more and more wise, but we can't have true wisdom. And the reason for that is that God would start with the whole, and for God, the parts would come from the whole, while for us as humans, we have to start from the parts and try to get to the whole. So what Kant means by that is God could understand the highest good, but God would also see what is the best plan for the world as a whole. He would see what would lead to the highest good. While as humans, we may be able to grasp the idea of the highest good just as well as God does. So just like him, we would understand that the highest good is the unity of happiness and deserving to be happy. But as humans, we could never deduce from that idea what the best plan of action would be to get there. So, for example, it is very clear that world peace would be part of the highest good. It is very clear that to be a good person, I should do my part to work towards world peace. So the goal, the purpose, is not hard to understand. But the way to get there, that's another matter. And I can only try my best to get towards that purpose of world peace. But I might think that certain actions lead toward it, while actually another path I could have taken would have contributed more to it. And only God would know which path would lead to world peace the best. But anyways, even though we can't ever be fully wise as human beings, we should still try to be, and that is what the philosopher does. And I think what is interesting and what is important here is that Kant includes morality in his concept of wisdom. To him, the wise person can only be a good person. He is also not just good, not just virtuous, but at the same time prudent. But being good is a central part of being wise. And nowadays, we live in an age of moral relativism. So most people would probably say there is no such thing as good and evil objectively. That's all just a matter of opinion and personal preferences. And there is no moral law. Well, I don't want to discuss that here. I will talk about Kant's moral philosophy at a later stage. But all I will say is that even if that were true, that would not mean that Kant's definition of wisdom is wrong. It would just mean that there is no such thing as wisdom. Just like saying a unicorn is a horse with a horn on its head, it doesn't become wrong if someone tells me, well, there are no horses with horns on their heads. That doesn't make my definition wrong. It just means that there is no such thing as a unicorn in the world. I already said in a previous lecture that philosophy, unlike natural science, is not about finding completely new truth that you didn't know before, but rather it is about taking that which unconsciously is already in us and bringing it to ever greater clarity. And that Kant does with the concept of science, that he also does with the concept of wisdom. Because I think if you look inside yourself and if you reflect on what you would consider wise, then you will find that indeed morality has always been part of our idea of wisdom. I mean, just think of who do we consider wise? Think of the stories we tell. Is there a wise character in some story, you know? And you will probably realize that you can't really imagine a wise villain. You can for sure imagine a smart and prudent villain, but if you imagine someone wise, he's probably always one of the good guys. He's probably the mentor of the hero or whatever. Certainly not the mentor of the villain. Or, I mean, if he is the mentor of the villain, then that will result in the villain later on becoming a hero. Like if you think of Uncle Iroh in Avatar and his mentorship of Prince Zuko. However, if we reflect a bit on wisdom, we can also find that it is kind of an old-fashioned word and it has fallen out of fashion. We tend to not talk about wisdom anymore and to not care about wisdom anymore. Like, you won't really find many people saying that they want to be wise, that their life's goal is striving towards wisdom, even though it should be the highest virtue that everyone should strive for. And it's also not likely that you will find people calling anyone. Certainly no one living, but in most cases not even anyone dead, calling anyone wise. And it just seems to not be something we even think about as a society, or we even care about. And it, no matter where you look, you can look at the universities. Even if you study philosophology, one could assume that, I mean, it's called philosophy, even though it's more like scholarship of philosophy and not actual philosophy. One could assume by the name that it would be about attaining wisdom, but for the most part, neither the professors nor the students care one bit about wisdom. I studied it for many years, and I can't remember wisdom ever being discussed all that much. But also in politics, we are maybe the first society in human history which doesn't have a political ideal of wisdom. In the past, if you look at antiquity, for example, in the past, it was very clear and obvious to many people that the ruler should either himself be wise, think of Plato's philosopher king, or at least have wise advisors that he should listen to. Now, I'm not saying that they actually were wise or actually had wise advisors. There was certainly a lot of unwise politics in previous ages as well. All I'm saying is they at least had this ideal in mind. While nowadays, we may support this or that party, this or that politician, and even think that someone is a good politician, that someone is smart and prudent and making good policies. But even then, we would probably not call that politician wise, and it doesn't seem to be something we think or care about all that much. In fact, it seems that wisdom has been reduced to something that can only exist in fiction. And even then, we don't really allow it in too realistic fictional works, but only in like fantasy works. So when we think of wisdom, of a wise person, we think of some old wizard with a long beard, or some wise Jedi master, or some wise old turtle in some animated kids movie. Almost as if wisdom was as fictional and as unrealistic as magic and dragons and talking animals. And all I want to point out now is that in this we are sort of consistent. Nowadays there is a disbelief in wisdom. Wisdom is taken as something that doesn't really exist. People can't really be wise. There's also this disbelief in morality. Morality doesn't exist. There is no moral law. There's a disbelief in idealism. There is a disbelief in philosophy and metaphysics, as I talked about in the last lecture. So all of these things are sort of disregarded and put on the side, and that is consistent. Because it all comes from the same root. And that root is what I call arationalism, which is not the same as irrationalism or irrationality. So by that I don't mean that people simply are not rational. Rather, arationalism, just like atheism, is meant to denote people not believing in rationality, not believing in reason. People nowadays, for the most part, are materialists. They are fixated on being, on that which is, which can be grasped. And since that is the reigning ideology, it makes sense to disregard philosophy, metaphysics, morality, wisdom, idealism altogether. And I don't want to discuss this in this lecture, though I will later on come back onto some of those topics. So I am here not trying to argue with the reigning ideology and to disprove it. Here in this lecture, I'm just trying to point it out. Because to me, it is important to think systematically and not in an aggregate. So to understand that these parts are not random. We could not, for example, live in a time that takes metaphysics very seriously, but at the same time doesn't believe in wisdom, or at a time that believes in a moral law, but at the same time completely disregards philosophy or whatever. No, all these pieces are not randomly put together pieces, but rather they are fruits from the same tree, and they will continue to grow together, or if the tree is ever cut down, they will vanish together. But you can't just take one out and replace it with something else. That is what I wanted to point out. This, of course, is true for other ages as well. An age is always somewhat consistent with itself. There are also contradictions, and there are always people who don't fit into that age, but the reigning ideology will have some sort of consistency, and certain pieces, even if you don't immediately see how they are connected, how they have the same root, them coming together is still necessary because they still do have the same root. But with that, back to Kant. The philosopher, he says, is the wise person or the person trying to be wise. And that determines the role that the philosopher has in society, or more narrowly in the sciences. Because Kant says the philosopher should be the lawgiver of reason. But before I explain that specific term, let me first make an important remark about the term lawgiver in general, because it is a term that Kant uses several times, not just when talking about philosophy, but also in his philosophy of justice, and in his philosophy of morality, and in his philosophy of religion. And he has a peculiar understanding of that word. It probably doesn't mean quite the same as you would assume, or as it would be used in daily life. Because when you hear lawgiver, you probably think, well, that is the author of the law. But Kant says the lawgiver isn't necessarily the author of the law. He is just the author of the compulsion of the law. What is that supposed to mean? Well, to Kant, there are laws that are necessary according to reason. And then there are laws that aren't. So, for example, let's go with the laws in the state, with the laws of justice. For example, that you shouldn't kill someone, or that you shouldn't rob, or that you shouldn't rape, or that you shouldn't beat someone up. Those laws, Kant would say, are not arbitrary. So that you shouldn't murder, or you shouldn't steal, or you shouldn't rape, or you shouldn't beat someone up, those laws, Kant would say, are necessary. They are not arbitrary laws, and they are not made up by the state. So you may live in a country where the law book says you are not allowed to murder, but Kant would say that doesn't mean that that state is free to decide to change that law and to one day say, well, from now on, murder is allowed. It could, of course, be done in theory, and I mean, it has been done. Maybe not that generally murder in general is allowed, but murder of certain people, of certain groups, like, for example, of the Jews, has been allowed by states. But that would just then be an unjust law, Kant would say. Because to him, even if there were no states, even if we lived in the natural state, it would still, according to reason, be wrong to murder or to steal. There just wouldn't be anyone to enforce it. So Kant would say, when the state, when the legislative says murder is forbidden, stealing is forbidden, they are not really making it forbidden, because it already was. All they are doing is stating that they will enforce that law. But the law itself isn't made by them, it is made by reason, Kant says. And only if it's a law that doesn't come directly from reason, so for example, traffic laws, they are somewhat random. So for example, it is a law that you have to stop at a red traffic light, and you can drive or walk at a green traffic light. We could change that. We could say, well, now the green light shows that you have to stand and the red light shows that you can walk. Only in those cases, Kant says, is the lawgiver author of the law and of the compulsion of the law. But if it's a law coming from reason, the lawgiver didn't make the law. He is just the one enforcing it and stating that from now on he will enforce it. And as I said, this is important to understand Kant correctly. Many misunderstandings of Kant's philosophy come from misunderstanding how he uses that word lawgiver. For example, in his moral philosophy, he says that, well, we have autonomy, which literally means giving yourself a law. And he says that is what morality is about, to give yourself a law. But lots of people, when hearing that, would say, well, then the law is arbitrary. Then I might give myself the law that killing is bad, but the next person could give himself the law that killing is all right, and say that to him killing is moral. So everyone would then have their own morality. But to Kant, there is only one moral law, and that law comes from reason itself. And when he says that we as individuals can and should give ourselves the moral law, he doesn't mean that we can just arbitrarily give ourselves any random law that we like. There is only one moral law, according to reason. And when I give myself that law, all I'm doing is enforcing it. All I'm doing is saying, from now on, I want to be moral. So from now on, I will force myself, even if I have certain desires that may drive me to immoral actions. From now on, I will force myself to not follow through on these desires, but to only follow this moral law. And even for God, this is true, according to Kant. So Kant does call God a lawgiver, but to Kant, God isn't what, unfortunately, he is in the minds of many believers. God isn't some heavenly despot who randomly makes up random laws to just make our life harder, who just randomly tells us, well, you must not be gay, and you must not eat this food and that food, and you must pray so and so many times. God is not some great tyrant in heaven who arbitrarily decided that murder is forbidden, but who could at any given time change his mind and say, well, now murder is not just allowed, it's commanded. You, Abraham, must murder and sacrifice your own son. No, Kant says, God can't do that. The law comes from reason. And God being the lawgiver just means that God enforces that law. So when God says murder is forbidden, that doesn't mean that he could also say murder is allowed if he just felt like it. It just means that he says, well, murder is forbidden, and I, God, will enforce this law. I, God, will punish you if you murder. But more about this in later lectures when I come to Kant's moral philosophy and his philosophy of religion. I just wanted to take this chance, because this is the first time in my lectures that the term lawgiver comes up, to already clear that up. The lawgiver to Kant is not the author of the law, he is the author of the compulsion. So he is the one enforcing the law, so to say. And that is also true for the philosopher. Once again, the philosopher, at least the philosopher in the world sense, so the wise person, the sage, the philosopher to Kant should be the lawgiver of reason. What does he mean by that? Well, the regular scientist to Kant, no matter if it's the mathematician or the logician or the natural scientist or even the metaphysician, if he is only dead and not also a philosopher in the world sense, not also wise, all of them, Kant says, are only Vernunftkünstler. That could be translated as the artist of reason. So artist here is not meant in the sense of someone producing beautiful art, but rather it means something like the technician of reason. So what the regular scientist does is he has cognition about this or that object, and now he can use that knowledge he acquired through his science, and he can use it in service of various purposes. So science leads to skills, Kant would say. It leads to being able to achieve any purpose, no matter what it is. As I said before, Kant would say that with the right scientific knowledge, you could be a good physician, creating a medicine to heal someone, but you could also be a good poisoner, creating a poison to kill someone. Because as a mere technician of reason, you just use reason for technical purposes. You just use reason as a tool to achieve certain goals, no matter what the goals are, no matter if they are good goals or bad goals. The philosopher in the world sense, on the other hand, being wise, is the lawgiver, or also the one knowing the laws of reason, Kant says. So his role should be to sort of be the governor of the sciences, because he alone, unlike the various scientists, he alone is focused on the true vocation of humanity, on the ultimate purpose, on the highest good. And therefore, he is the one giving the law of reason, because it is reason which states that the highest good is the highest good, that this is the purpose we should strive for. He is giving the laws of reason to the scientists and telling them to use their technique of reason only in service of that true vocation of humanity. Interestingly enough, this reminds me of Nietzsche. Nietzsche has a very similar idea of philosophy as Kant, at least insofar as that which Kant calls the world concept of philosophy is concerned. I'm mentioning that also because usually Kant and Nietzsche are taken to be two very different thinkers and are taken to be at odds with each other. And usually people would tell you that you can either agree with Kant or with Nietzsche. But then usually the people talking like that have no clue about either of them. I'm speaking as someone who hasn't just read all of Kant's works, but also all of Nietzsche's works and Nietzsche's notes. So maybe I'm a bit more qualified to say that, in fact, I find them agreeing on a lot of very important core positions. Maybe you can't always spot that so easily. Even the language is very different, and if you just look at the surface of Nietzsche, he does seem to disagree with Kant a lot. But I find they are very much in harmony with each other on many matters. I will point that out again when I come to other topics in later lectures. But now I'm pointing it out here. Because Nietzsche says that the task of the philosopher requires him to create values. The real philosophers are commanders and lawgivers. They say, "Thus shall it be." They determine first the whither and the why of mankind, and thereby set aside the previous labor of all philosophical workers. That is what Kant would call the technician of reason, and all subjugators of the past. They grasp at a future with a creative hand, and whatever is and was becomes for them thereby a means, an instrument, and a hammer. Their knowing is creating. Their creating is a law-giving. Their will to truth is will to power. So even down to the choice of words, calling the philosophers lawgivers, we can see Nietzsche in agreement with Kant. And I would add to that this is a very aufklärt understanding of philosophy and of what we ought to do. Because once again, let's look at the regular scientist. Kant calls him the technician of reason. Though, if you ask me, I would probably rather call him the mechanic of intellect. I would think that is more fitting. But since I'm talking not about my philosophy, but about Kant's philosophy, I will stick to his term for this lecture. And the Greek translation Kant gives is philodox, just like the translation for the lawgiver of reason is philosopher. The translation for technician of reason is philodox or philodoxa. Now, as the Greek word philosopher means lover of wisdom, so the word philodox means lover of opinion. And I think the important point here is that the philodox or the technician of reason, what he lacks is self-criticism. He might be great as a scientist. He might understand a lot of things, find a lot of knowledge, and therefore also be very skillful as a technician. But he doesn't have the self-criticism to really ask himself and really answer for himself, what should I know? And which purpose should my knowledge and should the skill coming from that serve, and which purpose shouldn't it serve? And self-criticism is what Aufklärung is ultimately about. So we can see that the regular scientist doesn't necessarily have this Aufklärung. Of course, a scientist can be aufklärt, but he doesn't have to be aufklärt to be a scientist, while the philosopher has to be aufklärt to be a philosopher. He has to have exactly this self-criticism, this asking, what is my actual vocation and purpose? And this may also explain why, to Kant, it's metaphysics which constitutes the core of philosophy taken in the school sense. Because in natural science, as well as in mathematics, we are trying to understand objects, and we are trying to understand something else than ourselves. And for the longest time, metaphysics was taken in the same way. So for the longest time, people would think that metaphysics too was about understanding certain objects. Supersensual objects like the soul or like God, but still understanding objects that are not we ourselves. But Kant's whole critical turn in philosophy leads to understanding that really we can only get to an object through intuition, through seeing the object, touching the object, hearing the object, and we don't have intuition of God or of the soul. So therefore, we really can't say anything about them. We can't find truth about them. Metaphysics is not really about an object, it's about the subject, it's about us, ourselves. Because if we use reason alone, that is our reason. If we use reason alone to think about God or to think about the soul, we will never find out what is God's own nature. Is there even a God or not? All we will possibly find is how do we have to think about God? What is the only possible way for us to think the idea of God according to how our reason functions? And we may not find out whether God exists. All we can find out is whether we have to think God. Maybe it is a necessary idea of our reason. Maybe we can't even rationally and without contradiction think of a world without God. Maybe. But even that wouldn't prove that the world can't be without God. That would only prove that we can't think the world without God. So that is actually Kant's big discovery and the big turn in philosophy, turning metaphysics away from the object and towards the subject, understanding that it doesn't help us learn more about the world, about things outside of us. It only helps us learn more about ourselves, about our own reason. So then, metaphysics would be the one science that deals not with objects but with the subject. It would be the one science that is self-critical of sorts. And then it would be the one science that is not trying to find out more knowledge about objects and thereby how we can manipulate and use those objects, how we can become more skillful, but rather metaphysics would be the only science where we find out knowledge about ourselves and thereby learn what is our vocation, what is our duty, what is it that we should do. And that is exactly why, since the philosopher should be the lawgiver of reason, since the philosopher should be the governor of the sciences and guiding all the other sciences, that is exactly why the philosopher to Kant is mainly the metaphysician, because he is the one fit for that job. For that reason, something like natural science or like logic is called by Kant a philosophical science, because the method of trying to get to knowledge is philosophical. It is rational cognition through concepts and not like in mathematics through the construction of concepts. But even though it is a philosophical science through its method, it is not true philosophy because it is not self-reflective. It is not reason understanding itself like it is in metaphysics, and therefore it doesn't enable that scientist to be a lawgiver of reason. Now, to be sure, nowadays philosophy is not granted that, so to say, legislative power in the body of the sciences. It's not like the scientists of the other fields are listening to the philosopher and asking the philosopher what they should do and what they should use their science for. And here again, I want to turn to Nietzsche briefly. The declaration of independence of the scientific man, his emancipation from philosophy, is one of the subtler after effects of democratic organization and disorganization. The self-glorification and self-conceitedness of the learned man is now everywhere in full bloom, and in its best springtime, which does not mean to imply that in this case self-praise smells sweet. Here also the instinct of the populace cries freedom from all masters, and after science has, with the happiest results, resisted theology, whose handmaid it had been too long, it now proposes in its wantonness and indiscretion to lay down laws for philosophy, and in its turn to play the master. What am I saying? To play the philosopher on its own account. My memory, the memory of a scientific man, if you please, teems with the naiveties of insolence, which I have heard about philosophy and philosophers from young naturalists and old physicians, not to mention the most cultured and most conceited of all learned men, the philologists and schoolmasters, who are both the one and the other by profession. On one occasion, it was the specialist and the Jack Horner who instinctively stood on the defense against all synthetic tasks and capabilities. At another time, it was the industrious worker who had got a scant of otium and refined luxuriousness in the internal economy of the philosopher, and felt himself aggrieved and belittled thereby. On another occasion, it was the color blindness of the utilitarian, who sees nothing in philosophy but a series of refuted systems and an extravagant expenditure, which does not any good. At another time, the fear of disguised mysticism and of the boundary adjustment of knowledge became conspicuous. At another time, the disregard of individual philosophers, which had involuntarily extended to disregard of philosophy generally. In fine, I found most frequently, behind the proud disdain of philosophy and young scholars, the evil after effect of some particular philosopher, to whom on the whole obedience had been forsworn, without, however, the spell of his scornful estimates of other philosophers having been got rid of, the result being a general ill will to all philosophy. But if we philosophers just accused the scientists and the scholars that they don't listen to us, that they don't submit to our will of power, as Nietzsche would say, that they don't let us be lawgivers and creators of values, to just complain about that and to just accuse them would not be very befitting of a philosopher. Because once again, Aufklärung is mainly self-criticism, not criticizing the other. So I want to read one last passage of Nietzsche's, because he also very keenly pointed out that the philosophers themselves, or those who call themselves that, are largely responsible for this fall of philosophy. On the whole, speaking generally, it may just have been the humanness, all too humanness, of the modern philosophers themselves. In short, their contemptibleness, which has endured most radically the reverence for philosophy and opened the doors to the instinct of the populace. Let it but be acknowledged to what an extent our modern world diverges from the whole style of the world of Heraclitus, Plato, Empedocles, and whatever else all the royal and magnificent anchorites of the spirit were called, and with what justice an honest man of science may feel himself of a better family and origin in view of such representatives of philosophy who, owing to the fashion of the present day, are just as much aloft as they are down below. It is especially the side of those hodgepodge philosophers who call themselves philosophers of reality or positivists, which is calculated to implant a dangerous distrust in the soul of a young and ambitious scholar. Those philosophers, at the best, are themselves but scholars and specialists. That is very evident. All of them are persons who have been vanquished and brought back again under the dominion of science, who at one time or another claimed more from themselves, without having a right to the more and its responsibility, and who now, creditably, rancorsely, and vindictively represent in word and deed disbelief in the master task and supremacy of philosophy. After all, how could it be otherwise? Science flourishes nowadays and has the good conscience clearly visible on its countenance, while that to which the entire modern philosophy has gradually sunk, the remnant of philosophy of the present day, excites distrust and displeasure, if not scorn and pity. Philosophy reduced to a theory of knowledge, no more in fact than a diffident science of epoche, and doctrine of abstinence, a philosophy that never even gets beyond the threshold and rigorously denies itself the right to enter. That is philosophy in its last throes, an end, an agony, something that awakens pity. How could such a philosophy rule? Nietzsche was also the first who very clearly saw the looming shadow of fascism. He wasn't listened to, however, and half a century later, fascism rose to power. And now, much, much worse is threatening us than the fascist dictatorships of the 20th century. And that should be cause for both those who despise philosophy from the outside and those who betray it from the inside to be self-critical and to ask themselves what price we will pay for not listening to philosophy and not letting philosophy govern as it rightfully should. Nowadays, science is pretty much devoid of morals. By this, I don't mean to accuse individual scientists. I'm not saying that every individual scientist is immoral. A scientist as a person can, of course, be moral, but science as a whole is not moral nowadays. It more or less lacks any sort of positive orientation, of positive goal. I mean, we are just doing research and trying to find knowledge for knowledge's sake. The recent past should have shown us what science without morals, what science that is a mere technique of reason can do. I'm not denying that science has also achieved a lot of good in the time since Kant. But still, in those 200 years since Kant's death, science has created the poisonous gas that was used on the battlefields of the First World War and in the gas chambers of the concentration camps. Science has come up with race theory, with all of its horrible consequences. and science conducted experiments on human beings in Auschwitz. Science has created the atomic bomb, which not just in the Cold War, but also nowadays still threatens our very existence. And science has led to the development of the technologies through which we now destroy our nature on this planet and thereby the very fundament of our civilization. This is what science without morals can lead to. And science as a whole nowadays is lacking any sort of positive orientation, of positive goal, because not just science, but society as a whole, we can also very clearly see that in politics, has no such positive goal, because we nowadays have no concept, no idea of a vocation of humanity. And so we can observe that science nowadays is just doing research and trying to find knowledge for its own sake. Or at best, there is this vague thought that with more knowledge, with scientific progress, we will be able to create new technologies and make our lives more comfortable, or to help the sick, to improve our medicine. But that's all. But we can't endlessly do research and find new knowledge. Kant says our horizon, our scientific horizon, has to have some sort of limit. The question, Kant says, is just how should the limit, how should the border of our horizon be determined? And Kant says it can be done in a dynamic way. That is, we let our abilities determine it. So we just continue seeking all sorts of knowledge, and we don't stop unless we reach a point where we simply can't go on, where we reach the limits of our understanding. Or, Kant says, it can be determined teleologically. So that means it can be determined by our purpose. So by thinking about what should we do as humans, what is humankind's vocation, and letting that decide what we should or shouldn't understand, what we should or shouldn't research. And that question, what should the horizon of our science, of our understanding be, and should we let our abilities, or should we let reason and our purpose determine it? That question, Kant says, was first brought up by Rousseau. And here you can see him be influenced by Rousseau and paying his respects to Rousseau for first having seen the importance of that question, which might also be why, out of all the modern thinkers, Kant credits Rousseau with coming closest to what a philosopher in the world sense should be. That is, a lawgiver of the sciences. And I want to stress here that the current ideology believes very much in progress, and that we made progress since Kant's time, but also if we go further into the past, since, for example, the Middle Ages. We like to applaud ourselves for our progress, for being so advanced in comparison to our ancestors. But I must confess, I don't see so much progress. Now, I don't want to downplay science's achievements, but I don't see a lot of that as real progress. I mean, to be sure, we now can buy robots that vacuum clean our homes, so we don't have to do it ourselves anymore. And I mean, even before we had those, uh, the vacuum cleaner was already an improvement to having to do it manually with a broom. But at the same time, as robots are cleaning some of our houses here in the West, on the other side of the earth, there are still people doing essentially slave labor, often underage people, often people working way too many hours a day in a way too hard work, getting paid way too little money. And unless that is improving, I'm not seeing the progress. Or likewise, to be sure, science has gotten people to walk on the moon. But at the same moment as the first human being stepped on the moon, there were thousands of human beings down here on Earth starving, dying of starvation. And all that money which went to shooting a rocket into the sky and sending some people to the moon, all that money could have gone into feeding those people. And I must say, I find it grotesque that nowadays we talk about colonizing Mars and we spend billions, governments and also certain companies and rich individuals spend literal billions on colonizing Mars, while there are still countless people here on Earth who are starving. And everyone who invests a single dollar into flying to Mars, while there's a single child left here on Earth who doesn't get enough food and water and shelter, everyone doing that is clearly evil and rotten to the core. And therefore, I think we should reconsider what we really mean by progress. In German, we have an expression, to saw on the branch that you yourself are sitting on. So you are sitting on the branch of a tree and you are trying to cut off that branch. And of course, if you succeed, you will fall down with the branch. It somewhat has a similar meaning to digging your own grave. Well, if you are doing that and you are doing it manually, then of course someone can come along, some technician of reason, using his scientific knowledge, using his skill to invent a chainsaw. And with that, you will be able to saw off the branch you're sitting on much more easily and much more quickly. But is that real progress, I ask you? I would say real progress would be you understanding that you need this tree, that you are sitting on the tree and being dependent on the tree. And real progress would therefore be to stop sawing on this branch, to maybe instead use your science to invent a fertilizer to make the tree grow taller and stronger and bigger. And nowadays we are at a point where we are talking about creating artificial intelligence, about colonizing another planet, about manipulating the genetical code of certain organisms and changing them, about cloning extinct species, and so on. And it seems that we are progressing here just as mindlessly and just as carelessly as we progressed in the last century at splitting the atom. And maybe before we do that, we should first think about what our real purpose is, what our real goal is. We should not blindly do everything we can just because we can do it, but rather we should think about what we should do. And thinking about that would be philosophy in the world sense. Before I move on, I want to talk about two implications of this world concept of philosophy as Kant describes it. The first is that we can see there's a connection between philosophy, which is about wisdom, and morality and Aufklärung. Aufklärung, I will talk about Kant's concept of Aufklärung in a much later lecture, but one could say that Aufklärung is nothing else but becoming wise. And Aufklärung, according to Kant, is essentially about leading yourself and not being led by others. But what does leading yourself mean if not being autonomous, being your own lawgiver? And the law you give yourself in Kant's philosophical system, again, this I want to talk more about in future lectures, but the law you give yourself through reason is the moral law. The law that makes you follow your true purpose, your true vocation as a human being. So therefore, one could say, Kant never says it explicitly, but I would say that it necessarily follows from all the things that he is saying. Therefore, one could say that every aufklärt person is a philosopher. Not in the school sense of philosophy. So not every aufklärt person is a metaphysician or has to be a metaphysician who tries to find scientific knowledge about God and freedom and the immortality of the soul. But every aufklärt person is a philosopher in the world sense, is a lawgiver of reason. And since Aufklärung is the task and the vocation of every human being, that would mean that, according to Kant, again, not explicitly, but implicitly, every human being should become a philosopher in the world sense. And that would mean that, according to this world concept, we can say that someone like, for example, Greta Thunberg, who very clearly is such a lawgiver, who has a very clear sense of what is the vocation of humanity, of the need for climate justice, who very clearly says, listen to the science, treat a crisis as a crisis and tell it like it is. That she is more of a philosopher than all the academic teachers of philosophy or of philosophology combined. That's the first remark. The second remark is this. Kant says the philosopher should be the lawgiver or the ruler of the sciences. The question is, how should this work practically? Well, when a law is given, there are really only two reasons why people follow that law. One is because there is some power forcing them to, and the other is because they themselves understand that this is a good law that should be followed. So, for example, murder is forbidden. Why don't we murder? Some people want to murder and just don't do it because they are afraid of the police and of the punishment that will follow. And others don't murder not because the state threatens them with punishment, but because they themselves understand that murder is wrong. And they would probably not murder even if there wasn't any police and any courts and any punishments. Well then, why should the scientist follow the laws that the philosopher gives. One option would be that he is forced to. That would, however, mean that the philosopher would have to work together with the government, and the government would have to turn that which the philosopher says. So when the philosopher says science should serve this purpose, this is the purpose of humanity, and science should stay away from these things and not do research into these things, then the government should enforce that and should punish the scientists for not following the philosopher. This would more or less mean that the philosopher would be the government or would be part of the government, and we would have the philosopher king of Plato or whatever. This would not just be a big attack on freedom and on the freedom of research and on the freedom of speech and the freedom of science and scholarship, it would also face the problem of, well, having to ask the question, who is a philosopher and who decides it? Because once we allow the government to do this, to enforce whatever the philosopher is setting as rules for science, the government could say, well, this guy here is a philosopher, we will go with his judgments. But would he really be a philosopher? Would he really be wise? This sounds like a recipe for despotism. And I don't think this is what Kant would want. I will talk about his philosophy of justice at a later stage, and it will be very clear that Kant is against despotism, that Kant wants freedom. But then, how else could the philosopher be a lawgiver of science? Well, there's only one other option, I already said it. The scientists would have to follow the laws that the philosopher gives, not because of a threat of punishment, but because they themselves understand those laws to be right and good. But how could they understand that? Only through their own reason, only through, so to say, giving those laws to themselves. But that would make them philosophers. And therefore, I would say, once again, this is not what Kant says explicitly, but I would say that it is a necessary conclusion you have to draw from his writings. I would say that according to Kant, every scientist, every scholar should be a philosopher. Again, not in the school sense. Not everyone needs to be a metaphysician. That can be a special field with its own specialists, just like all the other fields. But every scientist needs to be a philosopher in the word sense. And I mean, after my first remark, that should be clear anyways, because if every human being should be a philosopher, then it also follows that every scientist should be a philosopher. So every scientist should have the wisdom to understand what the purpose of humanity is and to use his science, to use his technique of reason, to use his skill only in service of that purpose. And this leads me to a term that Kant likes to use, but unfortunately I find that it is never really discussed when Kant is discussed, and most people, even people who are somewhat experts on Kant, seem to not know it, probably because I think it doesn't appear once in his published works. It appears more in his notes and in his lectures, and most people don't read those. It is the term of the cyclopean scholar. What does Kant mean by that? because he says that many scholars are cyclops. Well, as many people will be aware, the cyclops in Greek mythology is a one-eyed giant. And what Kant is saying is that many scholars may be giants as far as their scholarship is concerned, meaning they may have a lot of knowledge and may indeed be good scholars in that sense. But, he says, they only have one eye. And that eye is turned outward, toward the world, towards objects, the objects that they are studying and they are gaining knowledge about. But, Kant says, those cyclopean scholars are blind on one eye, or they are lacking one eye. And that is the eye of philosophy. And that is the eye that is not looking outward, but inward. That is the eye of self-understanding, of self-reflection. Once again, I would say that is the aufklärt eye, because Aufklärung is about self-criticism. And those cyclopean scholars might not be completely useless, because Kant says there's also a need for donkeys of the Parnassus. So they can collect data, so to speak, and give that data to the actual philosopher, and he then can use that data. I mean, that's what I am doing. I owe a lot to the scholars who collected all the works of Kant, who read through all the lecture notes by various students of Kant and compared them, who read through his own notes and tried to decipher his handwriting, and who collected these 29 volumes of Kant's works. And if it hadn't been for their scholarship, I wouldn't have been able to read all that Kant has written and talked, and to now do these lectures and write this book that I wrote, or these books. Even though those scholars themselves weren't philosophers, just historians of philosophy, and even though they probably didn't understand Kant truly, they probably understood a lot on a theoretical level, but they weren't truly wise. They didn't let this philosophy of Kant transform them and didn't apply it to life. And this, once again, is a sort in which Kant is close to Nietzsche, because Nietzsche says similar things. How the philosopher could use 100 scholarly dogs that he can send into the jungle to find data that he then can use. So those cyclopean scholars have their use, Kant would say, but still their cyclopean scholarship is dangerous, because it lacks self-criticism. They don't reflect enough about which purpose their scholarship should serve. They probably don't even reflect about their own data, so they might collect a lot of data and in a way gather a lot of knowledge, but maybe they are not critical enough of their own subject, and their giantness can make them arrogant. And so this cyclopean scholarship can lead to what Kant calls the egoism of science. Now, when Kant calls someone an egoist of science, he is not using the word in the exact same way we nowadays tend to use it. So he doesn't mean to say that someone is necessarily selfish and only serving his own interests and not the interests of others. But what he is saying is that someone is a cyclopean scholar. So someone is an expert of one field of science, and if he is an egoist of science, he now believes that he is an expert on anything. He now believes that he has the right, that he has the qualification to speak about anything and to judge anything, even if it doesn't belong into his field of science. And this, once again, is clearly a lack of self-criticism. And this was something that existed and was a problem in Kant's day already, but I would say that since then it has probably gotten worse. And especially nowadays, it is quite bad. And that is probably because nowadays there is a wider public that pays some attention to what the scientists do and responds to it. And so some of these egoists of science can find a big audience that reads their books or that listens to their lectures and podcasts and so on. And I would say that a lot of ideologues are flocking to them. So people who don't care about science, who don't care about truth, who just care about their ideology, whatever it may be. But when some egoist of science ends up saying something that fits their ideology, then they are happy about that, and then they will say, oh, see, here we have an expert, and this expert is confirming my ideology. And then they won't particularly care that maybe this scientist is not an expert in the field that he is talking about right now. It's enough that he is an expert of something to flock to him and to the credibility that his name gives to their ideology. And this is something we can see happening a lot nowadays. So whether it's during the COVID pandemic that some physician, some pediatrician, so a children's physician, suddenly became a virologist and an expert on COVID and told us that COVID isn't really a problem, but vaccines are. Or whether it's a chemist or a geologist suddenly being climate experts and telling us that there is no climate crisis. Or whether it's the historian writing a best-selling book wherein he spreads the most superficial cliches about ethnology, about religion, that come from the 19th century, but that actual ethnologists and anthropologists and people doing religious studies have long since abandoned, but this historian is still spreading them. Or whether it's the physicist who talks about free will not being a thing and who claims this in a show that is supposed to be about philosophy, no less, but for some reason invites physicists and not philosophers. Or whether it's the psychologist making outrageous and wrong ideological claims about society, culture, morality, and the biology of lobsters. Or whether it's a game theorist talking about morality and justice and not even being able to see the difference between the two. Or whether it's the biologist talking about God and how God doesn't exist. Or whether it's the engineer who at this point is pretty much a cliche himself, who dismisses any too theoretical, too speculative science, who dismisses any sort of philosophy as nonsense from the ivory tower, and who proudly claims that as an engineer he is a practical problem solver, which, I mean, in Kantian terms, means nothing else than saying he is a technician of reason, but not the lawgiver of reason that we so desperately need. And all of these people, even though ideologically there may be big divides between them, and even though some of them would not want me to, or would even be outraged at me grouping them in together with some of the others, they still are all the same in that they are all egoists of science. Meaning they all have their specific field, and maybe they are even good scholars in their field, but they are lacking self-criticism so much, and they are so arrogant and so one-eyed, so cyclopean, that they believe their expertise in one subject qualifies them to understand the world as a whole and to make judgments about things that they have never studied and that they have no clue about. A scientist or a scholar ideally should not be a cyclops. Fichte says this more openly and more explicitly than Kant does. Fichte, during his years as a teacher, as a professor, again and again held lectures about the vocation of the scholar and made it very clear to his students that they should not just be scholars who are learned in some subject, but that they should essentially be philosophers who have an idea of human purpose. So ideally, the scientist or the scholar should not be a cyclops, and even more importantly, even if he is a cyclops, in which case he can still have some use to the actual philosopher, he should under no circumstances be an egoist of his science, treating his science as if it could explain the whole world and as if it would qualify him to talk about other sciences. Now I'm getting close to the end of this long lecture. But there's still one more thing to talk about. Kant says the philosopher, and I think I have now shown that in the world sense, everyone should be a philosopher, and especially every scientist should be a philosopher. The philosopher should be a lawgiver. The question is, what type of laws does he give? In what areas does he give laws? And well, here Kant says there are three questions that the philosopher should ask. And those questions are quite famous, so if you know anything about Kant, maybe you have heard them before. The questions are, what can I know? What should I do? What may I hope for? The first question, what can I know, is to Kant the question of theoretical philosophy. And it is not about attaining specific knowledge about a specific thing, but rather it is asking, what can I know? Actually finding that knowledge is then the task of individual sciences, of math or of natural science. And here, that is what Kant showed in his critiques. Here the philosopher as metaphysician actually can't do much. He actually can't find a lot of knowledge. But what this question does, what can I know, is set the boundaries of our knowledge. And in this way, the philosopher here acts as the lawgiver, since he is telling the science as well, those are the limits of our human understanding. Within those limits, you can do your research. Everything that is within those limits, even if we don't know it now, we can potentially know. So we may not know if there's life on another planet now, but it is an empirical question. At least in theory, we could fly there or send a robot flying there and could try to find out. So that is something that we can know and we can do research into. But for example, God is outside of those limits of our reason, and we can't know, we can't prove if there's a God or not. So there is no point in even trying to prove or disprove it, because it's simply not possible. And in this way, the law for our theoretical science is given. Well, what should I do is the question of practical philosophy. This is about morality. How should I act? What should I do? What is my duty? And if we look at science specifically, and as the philosopher, as the lawgiver for science, then this would include asking, what should I do? What is my duty as a human? And therefore, how should I make use of science? How should I make use of my theoretical understanding? What should I even try to understand, and what should I maybe stay away from? How should I use the skills, the technologies that science brings me? How should I put them to use, and how shouldn't I put them to use? Well, and the third question, what may I hope for, is the question concerning religion, Kant says. Because this is not about, well, may I hope to win the lottery and become a millionaire tomorrow, but rather this is about, may I hope that there's a God, and may I hope that my soul is immortal, and that after this life I will live on and I will be rewarded for my good behavior. So in the third question, we could replace the word hope with belief. So what may I hope for? What may I believe in? And also it is important to stress that the word may here is not meant in a judicial sense. So this is not about what should you be allowed to believe in. Kant was an advocate of religious freedom. So if you want to believe in complete nonsense, no one should punish you for that. But the question is, what may I reasonably believe in? So is there a rational ground for believing in God and believing in the immortality of my soul? Or is it just an irrational belief? Is it just that maybe I believe in it because I would like to, I would like it to be true, it would fit my desires to live on and be rewarded, but I don't have any actual reason to really believe that it is true. That is what the third question is asking, and it is therefore to Kant the question in which theoretical and practical philosophy come together. Because on the one hand, I'm asking a theoretical question here. I'm asking, is there God? Is there immortality of the soul? But the thing is that theoretical philosophy can't answer this question. So the first question, what can I know, leads, among other things, to realizing I can't know if there's a God and if there is an immortal soul. But now I'm asking, even though I can't know, I can't prove it, do I still have a rational reason to believe that, and here's where practical philosophy, where morality comes into place, to believe that if I did what I should do in this life, if I did my moral duty, if I was a good human being, that I will live on and that I will have my eternal reward. Those are the three questions that make up philosophy in the world sense, according to Kant. And he says that there's a fourth question, and that fourth question is, what is the human? This, however, is not a fourth question in the sense, well, that it just goes along with the other three questions. Rather, Kant says, it is sort of the combination of the other three questions, because it can be answered through these three questions. We can say in the end, well, the human being is a being that can know these and that things, that should do these and that things, and that may hope for this and that. And I mean, if we were not asking for the human, but for some other being, we would answer the first three questions differently, right? So if we were asking about God, the question, what can I know, or what can he know, would be answered with everything. God is all-knowing. Or if we were asking about animals, the question, what should I do, or what should they do, would be answered with nothing. Animals have no free will. They are just ruled by their instincts, and therefore there is no should for them. They have no moral duty. They just do what they do, but you can't tell them that they should do something else. So we are asking these three questions specifically for humans, and thereby, when we answer these three questions, we find out what the human is. This fourth question, Kant says, is the question of anthropology. Anthropology being the science of the human, of humanity. However, this is not, Kant stresses, this is not empirical anthropology. Empirical anthropology would do research, would observe human beings in experience, would observe what they are doing, how they tend to behave, would try to learn more about their psyche, about the various cultures that humans have created. This is a different field. This year, this, so to speak, philosophical anthropology, or Kant actually calls it transcendental anthropology, is not trying to observe the various variations of humans and how humans actually live and behave in the world, but rather it is trying to a priori understand the core nature of humanity by understanding the limits of humans, understanding the laws that should govern humans, understanding what humans can know, should do, and may hope for. And this is one of the big accomplishments of Kant, to have shown that philosophy is not, as I already said, is not a science of objects, like for example of God or of the soul or of the world, but rather it is a science of the subject. It is the science of ourselves. And I think it is no coincidence that this was found in the age of Aufklärung, because once again, this I also said before, Aufklärung is about self-criticism. Aufklärung is about turning inwards. And of course, as an idea, that existed before too. It is the ancient Greeks who first came up with the famous saying, know thyself. But one could say that this ancient maxim was sort of abandoned in the pursuit of finding knowledge about something else, about the world, about God. And for many, many centuries, philosophers, metaphysicians tried to not know themselves, but to know something else, to know some objects. And the accomplishment of Kant and the Aufklärung accomplishment of Kant would then be, by stressing the world concept of philosophy and stressing how it is more important even than the school concept, to bring philosophy back, so to say, to bring wisdom back to its roots, to once again teach us and point out to us that what really matters here is us knowing ourselves, us understanding ourselves. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Kubilai Celik, Thomas Deuringer, Garnau Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Samit Özkilic, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufklärung course.